Okay, good morning. Today's daf is Nedarim daf membet. We are going to begin at the very top of daf membet. I'm going to share my screen, and we are continuing on in our discussion of the situation where one person makes a neder that somebody else is not allowed to benefit from them. Because Nedarim, we've said, is something that wicked people do, and we're in the Parshiot of Yaakov and Esav. I thought I would let Yaakov be our wicked neder maker, and he makes a neder that he's not going to allow Yaakov to benefit from any of his possessions, from anything that he owns. So now the question is, comes to the year of Shvius, also known as Shemitah. As a reminder, during that year, we effectively don't own our fields, and we certainly don't own the produce that results from the field. And so as a result, what's the status of that neder during that year? And we will see that there are two potential components. One is that it could be that when you make a neder about something that you own, it applies even after you no longer own it. The second is that it could be that it could also be that what is relevant here is the time that you make the neder. Meaning, if you make a neder, and therefore, actually, what I'm in connection with that first understanding, the timing of the making of the neder is crucial, because if you make the neder when you don't own the object, well, then you can't prohibit it. And so let's dive right in and let's take a look and see the question. So again, the fundamental question is how does Shemitah, or also known as Shvi'it, the seventh year, when the land must lay fallow and anything that grows is available to anyone to take. So what is the rule associated with that in connection with Yaakov and Esav? Again, Esav has said that Yaakov's not allowed to benefit from him. So now Yaakov is going around and he happens to be walking by Esav's field during the Shemitah year, and he sees a ripe juicy fruit, and he's like, I would love to eat that fruit. Is he allowed to, or is that fruit considered Esav's? So we're going to have in our Mishnah, I'll just note before we get started, an ambiguity. In particular, does the word lifnei shvius and bashvius apply to the time of the action or the time of the neder? So let's take a look. We'll interpret it one way, but then, and we'll see how in the Gemara we'll interpret it essentially both ways. So hamud or hanamich aveiro, if one says that they're going to, again, in this case, it's Yaakov, who has been prohibited via a neder to benefit from Esav, lifnei shvius, if it is before shvius, so einu yorer l'tosadehu. He's not allowed. Yaakov is not allowed to go into Esav's field because the field belongs to Esav, and that would be direct benefit. Ve'einu ochel min hanotos, and he's not even allowed to eat from branches that go out. Meaning the things that go out of the of his field. So let's say you've got a branch that goes out of the field, so then you're not allowed to eat from it. Uva shavius, and in the seventh year, well then einu yorer l'toch sadehu, you can't go into his field. About ochel hu min, and of course here the Bach takes out the word netios, but rather min hanotos. You can eat, would be allowed to eat from the field, from outside the field. Now that's the simplest understanding. And that's just simply because of the following, right? If in fact, the question is, and we'll see in the Gemara that on some, at least according to one opinion, why the distinction between the field and the fruit, that at least on one basis, the distinction is the following, that the field, you are allowed to enter. There is some sense of remaining ownership associated with it, and so maybe you're not allowed to go into the field, but the fruit you would be allowed to take. And so again, this the first and easiest way to understand this is that we're talking about a person made the neder before Shvius, and now the question is what's the story? Before Shvius, of course he can't go into the field, and of course he can't eat it because that's direct benefit. That would be a problem. And during Shvius, he can't go into the field because although the field is on some level considered hefker with respect to what grows there, it's not like somebody else could go into your field during Shvius and build a home, right? So it's not completely hefker. And so as a result, that would be the simplest understanding. The alternative understanding, and we will see that that is going to be a basis for the understanding as well, is the following, that when we say during Shvius and before Shvius, we're not talking about when the action is taken, but rather when the oath is made, when the neder is made. So if the neder is made before Shvius, then everybody agrees now we're talking about, and then what we're talking about in terms of the action, we're talking about during Shvius. So if the neder is made before Shvius, so then during Shvius, he's not allowed to enter the field and he's not allowed to benefit from it. And the reason is that you would assume is because once the prohibition on the fruit has begun, so then the prohibition on the fruit will continue into the year of Shvius. And similarly, once the prohibition on the land has begun, so too the prohibition on the land will continue. However, if in fact the oath is made during the year of Shvius, well, then that's then when it comes to the fruit, that fruit is hefker. So there was no ability to prohibit the fruit. You don't have the ability to prohibit fruit that you don't own to me. And so as a result, that fruit I still have access to. However, you do have the ability to still exclude me from your field. And so if you made the oath, if Esav were to make the neder to say that Yaakov can't benefit from him during the year of Shvius, well, then Yaakov would not be allowed to go into the field because that would be sufficient benefit. But Yaakov would be allowed to grab a fruit from outside the field that was, if the branch was extending beyond the borders of the land, he would be able to reach out and take such a fruit. Neder hemen. Now, what if the neder was not about all benefit, but neder hemenu ma'achal lifnei shvius? If the only benefit was about food, so then yoreh l'toch sadehu, then he would be allowed to go into the field, but he would not be allowed to, and this is lifnei shvius, right? If the person were to make the oath before shvius, so then he would be allowed to go into the person's field, because if you go into the person's field, that's not a benefit for food. And he would not be allowed to eat the fruit. And if such an oath were to be made on Shvius, well, then Yored v'ochel, then he would be allowed to. And again, you can understand this both ways. Either that Lifnei Shvius is referring to the time of the action, or Lifnei Shvius is talking about when the oath is made as opposed to the action. So those are the two different ways to understand our Mishnah. So let's, and I will note that, okay, now we'll pick up with the Gemara. So Rav Shmuel, so now we're going to have this debate between Rav and Shmuel on the one side. So even though Rav and Shmuel often disagree, in our Gemara, Rav and Shmuel are going to agree, and they're going to disagree or potentially disagree with Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And the first thing we're going to do is we'll detail the machlokes, detail what each of them said, and then we'll offer three explanations. The first two will say that there's a disagreement between them, and then the third one will adjust effectively the wording and say that that it is in fact not a disagreement at all. Okay, so Rav Shmuel to Amar Tavaihu. So Rav and Shmuel, they both say Nichasai. Now this is a change that is made by the Hagosabach, that it changes it from Nichasim to Nichasai. And so at least let me just see where's that going to. Yes, that's in the Hagosabach. So that is if I say that my possessions are forbidden to you, lifnei shvius, if I say that before shvius, ein yoreh l'toch sadehu, you're not allowed to go. That person is not allowed to go into his field. Ve'enu ochel min hanotos, and he's not allowed to eat the branches. Afal pi shehigia shvius, even though now shvius has come. So it's very clear that when Rav and Shmuel are talking about When they say lifnei shvius, they're talking about the time that the neder was made. V'im b'shvius nadar. However, if the person makes the neder on shvius, ein yored l'toch sadehu abal ochel min hanotos. So, according to Rav and Shmuel, our Mishnah, when it says lifnei shvius and bas shvius, it's definitely talking about the time of the neder. It matches up perfectly with what our Mishnah said. So that's exactly what the Ran points out. That and the point is, and if we take a look at the first Ran on the Gemara, the Ran says the kasavre Ravu Shmuel. This is the last of the wide lines at the top, and now the first of the narrow lines. That Rav and Shmuel think the following: that even though everybody agrees that the fruit themselves are hefker, that they're essentially ownerless, afilu hachi, even so. Since at the time that the person made the neder, hayu shalo, they belong to him. Chayil isura afilu b'shvius. The prohibition takes effect and it applies even during shvius. Shiyatzo mirushuso, even now that it has left his possession. So if I prohibit this mask to stand, and then this mask I sell it to Charlie, so this mask would continue to be prohibited to stand, even though it is left my possession. Okay, umasnisin trade dini katani, and according to this understanding, our Mishnah has taught us two new laws. Reisha ashmeinan tekevan shehediru lifnei shvius chayil nidra afilu kimata shvius. The first rule is that when because we made the neder before shvius and it took effect, it will continue to be effective even after shvius comes. The seifa and the second teaching of our Mishnah, ashmeinan te'im b'shvius nadar, that if you were to make an oath during shvius, nahi delo chayil nedrei ligabe peri tehefkara ninhu, the oath would not take effect. The neder would not take effect on the fruit because they don't belong to him. Ligabi ara, however, when it comes to the field, mia chayil, there it would take effect. Kedemefarish b'gemara, time will come. And as we will explain, there will be two reasons why the difference between the field and the fruit, and we will discuss that at the end of today. Okay, so that is the first interpretation. The first interpretation of our Mishnah, and that Rav and Shmuel seem to offer, is the fact that our Mishnah is talking about the timing of making of the neder, and if you make the neder before shvius, well, then the prohibitions all continue into shvius. But if you make the neder during shvius, because you don't own the fruit, you are unable to make the fruit prohibited. Now, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the Amri Tarvayu, the two of them say something different. Nechasai alecha. If I say that my possessions are forbidden to you, lifnei shvius, if I say it before shvius, ein yoreh l'toch sadeu, ve'ein ochel min hanotos. If I say it before shvius, well, then you can't, obviously before shvius that we're talking about now, you can't go into my field and you can't eat my fruit because they belong to me. And I said that you can't benefit from my possessions. Higia shvius. However, if shvius were to arrive, so then you still can't go into my field. Aval okelhu es hanosos, but you would be able to eat the things that are stuck out. And as the next Ran highlights, v'lo mitzer behu mishum nedra de mekamed b'shvius. And what's clear here is that even though I had successfully prohibited my fruit to you before shvius, it will not extend into the year of shvius, meaning that when I no longer own something, then it no longer becomes prohibited. So now let's take a look at three different possible explanations of what Rav and Shmuel on the one hand and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on the other hand are arguing about. So let's say that they're arguing about the following. The Rav Shmuel Sabre, that both Rav and Shmuel think the following. Adam oser davar shebershuso afilu l'kishiyetze mershuso. That Rav and Shmuel believe that it's possible to prohibit something when you own it, for even after you don't own it. So if I say that this is prohibited, again, this mask is prohibited to you, Stan, and now it no longer is owned by me, according to Rav and Shmuel, I can continue to prohibit it to you. You still won't be able to use it. Not that it would be particularly appetizing to use it, but you understand the point. And Rabbi Yochanan, the Reish Lakish Sabri, and on the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would say, "Ein Adam Osa Davar Shebershuso L'Kashiyetzim Yershuso," that you can't. Once it leaves my possession, I no longer have the ability to cause the prohibition to you. The Tizbra, but now we're going to challenge that approach. We're going to challenge this first explanation. And so we'll say that the first explanation doesn't work. Because is it really, does anybody really not think that you have that ability? Meaning the following. Let's note the connection that is very important to understand. When I make this mask to you, Stan, something that is prohibited, it's like I'm making it hektish. It's like I'm making it kodesh to you. That kedusha continues irrespective of my ownership. And so on some level, there's a big logic, especially when we are tying together these two concepts, the concept of a neder hana and the concept of hektish. Those two concepts, if we're tying them together, it makes a tremendous sense that that once I make something holy to you, that effectively you're not going to be able to use that ever, even when it's not owned by me. So im came and moreover, and in fact, im came, if you were to say that there is somebody who says that I lack the ability to prohibit something after I own it, niflagay b'nechasim elu. Now, what did both people say? Both of the commentary, as we had it in with the box emendation, both Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are talking about a situation where I say my possessions are prohibited to you, Stan. So if I say that, so then what's the implication of my possessions? So there, that may be that we could argue about whether or not after I own them, is that prohibition still does that prohibition still apply? Because I said my possessions, implying on some level that it was that there was a problem. So if in fact somebody were to say that you lack all ability to make prohibited after you own something that you own today, don't have Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish talk about somebody who says my possession. Let's talk about a stronger case. If I say this table is prohibited, now I have to own the table because that goes without saying. But I own the table at the moment, and I say this table is prohibited to you. That would be a big chiddush, because when I say this table, that implies I didn't say my table. I said this table. So that implies that I am attempting to prohibit it to you even after I no longer own it. And so as a result, if in fact somebody were to say that that doesn't work, they should definitely be very clear about that. And so as a result, the argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish should be the niflagu b'nechasim elu. They should be talking about these possessions, not my possessions. And I would know for sure if in fact my attempt to prohibit this table to you after I own it doesn't work. Well, then certainly if I were to say my table, it wouldn't work after I no longer own it. Okay, so that's contradiction number one that we have or problem number one that we have. In addition, there's another problem with trying to say that Rav and Shmuel on the one hand, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on the other hand, are arguing about whether or not one can prohibit something after one no longer owns it. Because we have a Mishnah that pretty much says that you have the ability to make that prohibition. Because we're going to learn in a few days the following. Hatanan, we have a Mishnah to Adam Oser Davar Shabrashusa that Mirashusa, that in fact a person does have that ability. And what does the Mishnah say? Ditnan, we have this Mishnah. This Mishnah is on Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. And Ha'omer Livno, Konum Sha'atan Neneli. Listen, my son, I'm going to say that you're not allowed to benefit with a konam. You're not allowed to benefit. That's what somebody says. So Meis Yerashanu. But if the guy dies, the son is allowed to inherit, because what did the person say? You're not allowed to neneli. You're not allowed to benefit from me. So, but if the person says if the person says that the child's not allowed to benefit while he's alive or even after he dies, as we turn to Membet Amabet, even if the person dies, lo Yerashanu, he's not allowed to inherit. So what do we see? We see that even though the possessions after the person dies no longer belong to him, the father was able to prohibit his son from benefiting from them. And that's why the son is effectively excluded from the inheritance. He's wiped out. Exactly. It needs to be in the trust. So the point is that we have that ability. So it's clear that you can prohibit something even when you don't own it. Well, no, 1 second. All right. So the question was on Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, because they were the ones who said that you can't prohibit fruit on Shvi'it because you didn't own it now. So what would they say? How would they explain themselves here versus the Mishnah? So they could explain Shiny Hacha. No, that Mishnah is different. Because the person was very clear. So we're modifying now what Rav and Shmuel are saying. What Rav and Shmuel are saying is that if you're 100% clear, if I say that this table should be prohibited to you, Stan, whether I own it or not, well, then, of course, everybody agrees that I have the ability to prohibit it. However, if I use something that is more ambiguous in terms of language, so then maybe Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would say, no, listen, the person was not clear about their language. And so as a result, as soon as they don't own it, the presumption is that the prohibition is only about ownership. And so as soon as they don't own it, it would be permitted. But 1 second, Mikomakom Kasha, 1 second, what about our first question? We still had our first question about why didn't they argue about Nechasim Elu rather than Nechasai? If in fact Nechasim Elu would be powerful enough, they should argue about that. So as a result, Ella b'Nechasim Elu, Kuli Alma Lo Pligi. So it must be that when it comes to saying this table is prohibited to you, so then the table will be prohibited to you whether I own it or not, because I did not reference my Ki Pligi. Where is it that Rav and Shmuel on the one hand and Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan on the other hand would argue? B'Nechasai, when it refers to my own possessions. So if I refer to my own possessions, well then Rav Shmuel Sabri, Loshan Nechasim Elu Loshan Nechasai. It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference. What my intention is, clearly, according to Rav and Shmuel, whether I say this table or my table, my intention is that this table should always be prohibited to you. I am not trying to, the emphasis is not on the word my, it's on the table. And so as a result, it would be prohibited, Adam Oser, and a person has the ability to prohibit something even when they no longer own it. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish Sabri, however, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would say, no, Nechasim Adam Oser. If I say this table, yeah, I have, and actually the Bach here adds Elu, Nechasim Elu, Adam Oser. If I say this table, I have the ability to prohibit it to you, Nechasai. But if I say my table, Ein Adam Oser, then the person's intention is presumably, as long as it's their table. When it's not their table anymore, presumably they're okay with it. Now, what did we end up saying here? The end result is that Rav and Shmuel don't care whether you say this table or my table. In both instances, they would say that the intention is even when I no longer own it. But there's a problem. Is there really somebody who doesn't care whether I say my table or this table? Because it makes sense. The Hatanan, we actually have a Mishnah that makes such a distinction without anyone arguing. And since Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are Amoraim, or specifically Rav and Shmuel are Amoraim, so then they need to be consistent with this Mishnah. So the problem is that if we're going to say that they believe that in fact that there's no difference between the two statements, how do they coincide their opinion with this Mishnah? Because what does the Mishnah say? And this Mishnah is also coming up. We're actually going to learn this even before the other Mishnah. This Mishnah is on Mem Vav Amud Aleph. So Konam. So what if the person Ha'omer lechaver, if a person says to his friend, Konam otoch beischa sh'ani nichnas, I'm not going to enter beischa, your house. So I'm prohibiting for myself benefit from your house. Sadcha shano lekech, I'm prohibiting my right to your field. Mace oshamachro at la'acher, if you sell your house stand to somebody else, or you sell your field to somebody else, or if God forbid somebody who said that were to die, so mutter, then I am allowed to benefit from it. Because what did I say? I say sadcha, beischa, your house, your field. So as a result, it's all about the your. The your is what matters. So l'bayit zeh, however, if I were to say this house, shani nechnas, oh, sadezo shani lokeh, or this field that I buy, mace o mishemachro la'acher, if the person who owned the field at the time sold it to somebody else or died, asur, then the person who made the vow still can't benefit from it because he did not focus on the ownership aspect. So we see that actually focusing on the who owns it does indicate that your intention is to emphasize the ownership aspect. And so if I say my table, then if it's no longer my table, it's not going to be prohibited. And so how can Rav and Shmuel be arguing with this Mishnah? They can't be. So as a result, third approach, and effectively there's no argument whatsoever between Rav and Shmuel and Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And what is it? Ella ki amri Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rather, when did Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish make their statement? B'nechasai, when it was said nechasai, my possessions. And Rav Shmuel b'nechasim elu, and that when Rav and Shmuel made their statement, they were talking about a situation where the person said these possessions. So below pligi, and they don't argue. The question is what was said. And so when it comes to so all that matters is, so we have now two things that matter, two effective components to our Mishnah. There could be when you make the oath, that if you make the oath before Shvius, well, then it depends on how you've worded the oath. If you make the oath before Shvius and you say my field, my possessions, well then during Shvius, it's not a problem for the person to grab the fruit because you said my, and they don't belong to you. But if you say these fruit, this land, etc., so then the intention is even when it becomes Shvius to be prohibited. And then and so that's so we actually have two distinctions, and depending on what was said and when you're talking about, those two factors will come in together to determine what exactly is prohibited. So we revised our Mishnah to understand it effectively in two different ways. That when we're talking about that when I make the oath makes a difference, that's only if I say if I say these possessions, these things, then it makes a difference when I make the oath. But if in fact I say my possessions, well, then it doesn't make a difference when I make the oath, because when I no longer own the possession, the oath no longer applies. Okay, so now again, what did we say at the end of our Mishnah? And with this, we'll conclude. The end of our Mishnah said there's that there's a big difference between eating and entering the field. We said that Shvius ein yored l'tosadeu, that on Shvius you can't enter the field, but lifnei Shvius, then you could enter the field, but you could not eat. I'm sorry. That goes on. That goes on the very beginning of the second case of our Mishnah. That when it's on Shvius, you can't go into the field. But you're allowed to eat from the fruit that extends outside the field. So, what's the reason that you can eat from the fruit, even though I have prohibited my stuff to you? The reason that Yaakov is allowed to eat from Esav's fruit is the peri de hefkerin, because they're hefker, they're ownerless. And so as a result, because they're ownerless, they don't belong to Esav any longer. And so Esav's oath to prohibit Yaakov from benefiting from his fruit doesn't apply. So, well, Aranami Afkara, well, why shouldn't he be allowed to enter the land? The land is also hefker, right? Because again, during Shvius, both the land and the fruit are considered on some level ownerless. So Amar Ula explains, but Omdin Ilanos al Hagvulim, we're talking about trees on the border. And because the tree is on the border of Esav's property, Yaakov doesn't have to go into the field in order to access the fruit. And when we say that that Esav's field is ownerless, that's only in order to let somebody access fruit that can't be accessed otherwise. This tree can be accessed from outside the field. So as a result, he's not allowed to enter. And the Ran explains that nicely. So we take a look, and the Ran 8 lines up. Amar Ula ba'omdim ilanos al hagvulim. Ula says that we're talking about where the trees are on the border. So einachinami delilkot ilanos shebeemta hasada mutar leire letocha. It's certainly true that in fact, if I wanted to stand your fruit in the middle of your field, even if you were to make an oath prohibiting your field to me, I would be allowed to go to the middle of your field to access that fruit, because that's the only way I can access it. And the field is considered hefker, and your fruit is considered hefker, so you don't own it. So I'm not benefiting from you. But I don't have the right to go into your field for your trees that are on the border. Because to the extent that your field has been made hefker by the Torah, it was made hefker, it was made ownerless only to allow me to go in to cut. But Hilka kevan she'ilanos halalu yachal lilkot otam lo yered. But when it comes to these trees that are on the border, I don't need to enter your field in order to access them. And so as a result, I don't have a right. I was only allowed to enter your field. Your field is only considered hefker for me to go into your field in order to get the fruit. I don't need to go into your field to get this fruit. And so as a result, that's what we're talking about. Now that's a big chiddush in our Mishnah, that our Mishnah is talking about the very narrow case of the tree on the border. However, there's a reason that Ula didn't like the next answer, and let's take a look at the next answer, and then we'll explain why that is. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yakim says, no, it's not about just the trees on the border. No, it's not actually a biblical concern. It's a rabbinic concern. And the rabbinic concern is that maybe somebody will stay beyond the time that they're supposed to gather. So yes, the reason that a field is hefker and you're allowed to enter it ordinarily is because you're allowed to enter the field. The Esav's field is considered ownerless for Yaakov with respect to entering and getting fruit. But the problem is that if Yaakov spends an extra second there, and decides, you know what, this is such a beautiful field, I want to just relax here. That additional second is prohibited, because the only nature in which his field is hefker is in order to get fruit. So if the person were to stay even an extra moment, it would be prohibited. So the rabbi said, listen, we're really worried that the person is going to stay that extra moment. Don't do that. And so let's take a look at the Ran. The Ran is 6 lines up. Rosh Shimon ben Eliakim Omer Gzeira Shema Yisha Ba'amida. We're worried that the person is going to stand there. And therefore, even going to enter the field, going to access a tree in the middle of the field would be prohibited, according to this understanding. But and even though it would be really permitted according to the Torah, because the land itself is hefker, because of the gzeira, because of this rabbinic decree, we are going to prohibit it. Now, the Ran here points out a distinction from a few days ago, because a few days ago, we learned that if you go to visit somebody that you are not allowed to benefit from, you should not sit when you're visiting them if they're sick, right? If you're going to visit them when they're sick, you should not sit down, because we're worried that, and then we're talking about when you go into their field. So we're worried that by your sitting down, again, we're worried that you're going to stay too long, and therefore you won't actually be formally benefiting the person and visiting them, and therefore it won't be okay. And as a result, you'll have taken some benefit, and that will be prohibited. So the question is, now here we're concerned that a person will be in the field too long, even when the person is standing. So why don't we have that concern earlier in connection with the person visiting the sick? Vila'el gabichola lo gazar Shmuel ela shema yisha b'yeshiva. The concern that Shmuel had was only if the person is sitting. If we have this position of Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim, why not be concerned even if you're standing? Aval ba'amida lo gazar. There was no gzeira when it came to standing. Te'im kain litzar bilibakro. We should just prohibit visiting the sick completely. Afilu omed hasam, even if one were to stand there. So hainu taima mishum de kevan de derech mevaker leishiv. So the Ran points out a very important principle that actually has ramifications for when we visit the sick. That when we visit the sick, the custom is to sit down with the sick, to be present. And this is a very important lesson in pastoral counseling as well, that when you go to visit somebody, you sit down, don't stay standing, because standing suggests that you're in a rush, that you want to show that you're there to be with the person. And so as a result, and that's why when it comes to Birkur Cholim, if you sit down and you're prohibited from benefiting from the person who's sick, well, then we're worried that you're going to stick around. And again, we're talking about where you're visiting the sick person in their home, because you're not allowed to benefit from the land that they own. If you were to visit them in the hospital, presumably that wouldn't be a concern. But here we're talking about we were visiting them on their land. So therefore, you can, even when you're visiting them on their land, you can stay standing because you won't stick around too long. But va'atam matzricho la'amod, right? So therefore, we have him standing. So isla hikara. So there'll be a way that he will know to himself. He'll remember, why am I standing? I'm standing because I'm not allowed to benefit from this guy. So as a result, I won't stick around. V'lo yisha, and so as a result, he won't stick around while he's standing, because he'll remember the whole reason that he's standing is because he's not allowed to sit, because he's going to benefit. Aval hacha, my hekera islay. But here, what is the signal to himself that he won't be able to benefit? Ha ein derech lilkot es haperos ela ba'amida v'shayach lemigzar shema yisha. So when it comes to cutting, so the fruit, that's the way you cut fruit. You pick the fruit while you're standing. So there's no sign for him that he should know not to stand. So that is the Ran on this. And with that, I will note that what's the story with lending and borrowing? Can I lend or borrow from somebody from whom I've prohibited benefit? Well, for that, you'll have to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. All right, neither lender nor borrower be. Absolutely. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all tomorrow, God willing.